Jon Snow stood alone, gazing across the snow-covered plains of Winterfell, knowing full well what he was up against. Ramsay Bolton, the twisted usurper of the North, had the numbers and the home field advantage. But Jon had something Ramsay could never understand: a loyalty built on respect, not fear. His decision to meet Ramsay in open battle wasn't just about reclaiming Winterfell. It was about honor, family, and righting the wrongs that had plunged the North into chaos. This battle, often referred to as one of the most visually captivating and brutal in Game of Thrones, brought a sense of realism rarely captured on television. It wasn't just the spectacle of thousands of soldiers clashing on a blood-soaked battlefield. It was the raw emotion, the desperation in Jon's eyes as he faced overwhelming odds. There was no grand strategy or clever trick to even the odds. Jon was outnumbered, his forces dwarfed by Ramsay's legions, and he knew it. But that didn't stop him from charging headfirst into the fray, a lone warrior desperate to save his home. In that moment, his fate seemed sealed, swallowed by the sheer force of the Bolton army. The infamous shield wall, tight, unyielding, was a death trap, slowly suffocating any hope of victory. And yet Jon kept fighting, clawing his way through the battlefield, blood and mud blurring the line between life and death. It's impossible to discuss this battle without acknowledging the tactical choices that defined it. Ramsay's cruel brilliance shone through in the early stages as he manipulated Jon into making rash decisions driven by emotion rather than logic. The Bolton archers unleashed volley after volley of arrows, creating a hellish landscape where survival seemed impossible. Jon's forces, though loyal, were woefully unprepared for the brutality that awaited them. Ramsay's strategy was simple: draw Jon in, let his emotions cloud his judgment, and crush him with overwhelming force. But even amidst this brutality, there were glimmers of hope. Jon, with his unwavering determination, refused to back down. His decision to charge directly at Ramsay's forces, sword in hand, was a defining moment, a reflection of his belief that leadership isn't about staying behind the lines, but standing shoulder to shoulder with your men. As he rode toward the enemy, knowing full well it might be his last charge, there was no hesitation. The desperation in his charge, the fury in his eyes, showed a man willing to die for his family, his home, and the North. Sansa Stark, however, played a different game. While Jon faced the brutality of Ramsay's forces on the front lines, Sansa was quietly working behind the scenes, securing the aid of the Vale. Her strategic move to call upon Littlefinger and the Knights of the Vale turned the tide of the battle. Sansa's role in the victory cannot be overstated. Without the timely arrival of the Vale's cavalry, Jon's forces would have been crushed beneath the Bolton onslaught. The cavalry, charging in like a hammer, shattered the Bolton lines and broke Ramsay's control over the battlefield. Sansa's transformation throughout the series is highlighted in this moment. No longer the naive girl who dreamed of knights and chivalry, she had become a pragmatic leader. She knew Ramsay better than anyone, his cruelty, his love for psychological games, and she played her hand with precision. While Jon fought with honor and valor, Sansa fought with cunning, understanding that survival often requires more than just strength. The physical intensity of the battle mirrored the emotional stakes. As arrows rained down and the bodies piled high, the battlefield became a chaotic storm of violence and desperation. The infamous moment when Jon was nearly trampled to death suffocated by the weight of the dead and dying, became symbolic of his struggle to lead. He had faced death countless times, but this was different. He wasn't fighting just for himself. He was fighting for the soul of the North. His desperate gasp for air, clawing his way to the surface, was as much about survival as it was about his journey from a misunderstood, illegitimate son to a true leader. This battle also showcased one of the most memorable visual moments in the series. Jon's lone figure standing against Ramsay's charging cavalry, ready to meet his fate. It was an image burned into the minds of viewers, encapsulating Jon's bravery, recklessness, and sheer determination. As the horses thundered toward him, there was no turning back. Jon's personal evolution from a boy who never quite knew his place in the world to a leader willing to risk everything for his people was on full display. When the Vale's forces finally arrived, the Bolton army crumbled under the weight of the combined Stark and Vale onslaught. Ramsay, always smug and overconfident, retreated to Winterfell, hoping to hold out behind its walls. But this time, there was no escape. Jon, battered but unbroken, pursued him relentlessly. Winterfell, the ancestral home of House Stark, had been desecrated by Ramsay's cruelty, and Jon's reclamation of the castle wasn't just a military victory. It was a personal triumph. The North had been torn apart by war and betrayal, but in that moment, it began to heal. Ramsay's downfall was poetic. The man who had inflicted so much pain, who had thrived on fear and sadism, met his end not on the battlefield, but in the very same kennels where he had tortured others. His final moments as he was devoured by his own hounds were a fitting end to his reign of terror. And as Sansa walked away, there was a sense of justice, not just for her, but for the North as a whole. She had outlasted him, outsmarted him, and in the end, had reclaimed her home. Jon's victory in the battle wasn't just about defeating Ramsay. It was about solidifying his leadership in the North. The Northmen, once divided and disillusioned, rallied behind him as the true heir to Winterfell. The battle wasn't just a physical test. It was a test of Jon's character, his resilience, and his ability to inspire those around him. And as he stood in Winterfell's great hall, the seat of his ancestors, there was a quiet acknowledgement that the North had found its leader. Yet, this victory, hard-fought and earned through blood and sacrifice, was only the beginning. The true battle, the one that would decide the fate of all the living, loomed on the horizon. But for now, the North could breathe a momentary sigh of relief, knowing that Winterfell was once again in the hands of House Stark, where it belonged. The Battle of the Illegitimate Sons may have decided the fate of the North, but not every contest in Westeros is fought on a battlefield. Sometimes wars are waged between two individuals, each carrying the weight of their house, their honor, and, in some cases, their vengeance. And few moments in Game of Thrones were as intense or unforgettable as the trial by combat between Oberyn Martell, the Viper of Dorne, and Gregor Clegane, the Mountain. Where Jon Snow and Ramsay Bolton's battle was a clash of armies, this was a duel of men, a spectacle that, in many ways, felt more personal. Oberyn Martell wasn't just fighting for Tyrion Lannister's life. He was fighting for justice, for his family, and for the memory of his sister, Elia Martell, who had been brutally murdered by the Mountain years before. For Oberyn, This wasn't about saving a Lannister. It was about confronting the monster who had haunted him and his people for decades. From the very beginning, Oberyn's motivations were clear. His thirst for vengeance had brought him to King's Landing, but his charm and wit had masked the deeper rage that simmered beneath the surface. This trial by combat was his chance to finally avenge his sister's death, to make Gregor Clegane pay for the atrocities he had committed during Robert's rebellion. And as he stepped into the arena, armed with his spear and his unshakable confidence, it seemed as though the odds might finally turn in favor of justice. The fight itself was a masterclass in choreography. Oberyn's agility and finesse contrasted sharply with the brute strength and raw power of the Mountain. Where Gregor Clegane lumbered slow but unstoppable, Oberyn moved like a dancer, every step precise, every strike intentional. He taunted the Mountain, using his speed and skill to keep the giant at bay, all the while demanding that he confess to the crimes he had committed against Elia. It was more than just a fight. It was a performance, a carefully orchestrated display of Oberyn's prowess and his unrelenting desire for the truth. For a moment, it seemed as though Oberyn might actually win. He had landed several blows on the Mountain, wounding him, weakening him. The audience, both in the show and those watching at home, held their breath as the Viper seemed to have the upper hand. Tyrion, whose fate hung in the balance, allowed himself a glimmer of hope. And for Oberyn, it wasn't enough to simply kill Gregor. He needed to hear him admit to the horrors he had inflicted upon Elia and her children. His need for justice, for closure, blinded him to the danger that still lingered. And then, in one of the most shocking twists in Game of Thrones, everything changed. In his pursuit of a confession, Oberyn made a fatal mistake. He got too close. The Mountain, with a burst of strength that seemed impossible after the beating he had taken, grabbed Oberyn and, in one brutal move, turned the fight on its head. The crowd's cheers turned to gasps as Gregor Clegane crushed Oberyn's skull with his bare hands, silencing the Viper forever. The psychological impact of this moment was immense. For Tyrion, it was a death sentence. He had placed his faith in Oberyn, believing that the Viper's skill and determination would save him. Instead, he was left staring at the remains of a man who had come so close to victory, only to fall in the most devastating way. The audience, too, was left reeling. Oberyn's death wasn't just a loss for Tyrion or Dorne. It was a reminder of the brutal and unforgiving nature of Westeros, where even the most skilled and righteous can be undone in an instant. The consequences of this trial by combat rippled far beyond the immediate aftermath. For House Martell, Oberyn's death was a tragedy that would ignite tensions between Dorne and the Iron Throne. His daughters, the Sand Snakes, would seek to continue their father's legacy, driven by the same thirst for vengeance that had consumed him. Dorne, which had always been somewhat isolated from the rest of Westeros, now had a reason to involve itself in the greater conflicts of the realm, its desire for retribution against the Lannisters becoming a driving force in the later seasons of the series. As for the Mountain, his victory in the trial by combat came at a cost. Though he had bested Oberyn in the end, the Viper's poisoned spear had done its damage. Gregor Clegane's slow, agonizing descent into death, and his eventual resurrection as a mindless, monstrous servant of Cersei Lannister, was a fitting end for a man whose entire life had been defined by violence and brutality. The Mountain may have won the fight, but his humanity was stripped away in the process, leaving behind a shell of a man, more beast than warrior. Looking back, Oberyn's fight with the Mountain wasn't just a trial by combat. It was a pivotal moment that shifted the power dynamics in Westeros. It showed the fragility of life, the dangers of underestimating an opponent, and the price of letting vengeance cloud one's judgment. Oberyn had the skill, the motivation, and the passion to win. But in the end, it was his need for closure, for that final confession, that led to his undoing. In a world like Westeros, where betrayal and brutality often outweigh honor and righteousness, Oberyn's fall serves as a stark reminder that even the most righteous causes can be lost in the pursuit of justice. His death was not just a loss for his house, but for the ideals he represented, the belief that one man could stand against tyranny and win. It was a noble cause, but in the end, nobility was not enough. As we move from the brutal clash at Winterfell to this unforgettable duel, we see the different ways in which battles are fought and lost in Game of Thrones. Sometimes it's an army that decides the fate of a kingdom. Other times it's a single man standing against overwhelming odds. But whether it's a battle of swords or wills, the consequences of these confrontations ripple throughout the realm, shaping the future of Westeros and the lives of its people. In the case of Oberyn Martell, the Viper may have fallen, but his legacy, his desire for justice, would live on in the hearts of those who survived him. As the trial by combat between Oberyn and the Mountain left an indelible mark on Tyrion Lannister, his true moment of glory came during one of the most pivotal battles in Game of Thrones, the Battle of Blackwater Bay. Unlike Oberyn's duel, this was not a personal confrontation, but a massive, large-scale clash that would decide the fate of King's Landing and, by extension, the Iron Throne itself. Tyrion, often underestimated and ridiculed, would step up in a way that no one saw coming, proving his worth not only as a Lannister, but as a brilliant strategist and leader in the face of overwhelming odds. Stannis Baratheon's march on King's Landing was nothing short of determined. He was a man of unshakable resolve, convinced that his claim to the throne was just and righteous. Stannis, unlike many of the pretenders vying for the crown, had a deep sense of duty. He believed the Iron Throne was his by right, and nothing would deter him from taking what he felt was owed. His fleet, led by Sir Davos Seaworth, sailed toward King's Landing with the confidence of a conqueror. Stannis's forces were stronger, more disciplined, and by all accounts should have been able to overwhelm the city's defenses. But what Stannis didn't anticipate was Tyrion Lannister's cunning. While many in King's Landing, including Tyrion's own family, doubted him, the battle gave him the chance to prove his worth. Tyrion wasn't a warrior, nor did he possess the brute strength of men like Gregor Clegane or Stannis Baratheon. What he had was a sharp mind and an ability to see what others could not. Tyrion understood that a straightforward defense of the city would result in certain defeat. King's Landing simply did not have the manpower to withstand a direct assault from Stannis's forces. Instead, Tyrion turned to one of the most dangerous and unpredictable weapons in Westeros: wildfire. The use of wildfire was a gamble, volatile and deadly. The green liquid had the potential to destroy not only Stannis's fleet, but King's Landing itself. Tyrion, however, saw its potential and understood how to harness it to create chaos among Stannis' forces. His plan was as audacious as it was brilliant. Lure Stannis' fleet into Blackwater Bay, where they would be met not with swords or arrows, but with an inferno. It was a risk that paid off spectacularly. The sight of wildfire igniting the bay is one of the most visually striking moments in the series. As Stannis' fleet approached the city, Tyrion's trap was sprung. The explosion was devastating, a wall of green fire engulfing ships and men alike, turning the waters of Blackwater Bay into a blazing inferno. In an instant, the momentum shifted. What had once seemed like an inevitable victory for Stannis became a scene of utter chaos and destruction. The wildfire tore through the heart of Stannis' navy, scattering his forces and leaving them vulnerable. Ser Davos, Stannis' loyal hand and one of the most honorable men in Westeros, played a significant role in the battle, though it came at a great personal cost. Davos had long served Stannis with unwavering loyalty, despite their differences in faith and temperament. As a former smuggler, Davos knew the dangers of the sea, but even he couldn't have predicted the devastation that Tyrion's plan would unleash. As his ship was consumed by wildfire, Davos lost his son, a blow that would haunt him for the rest of the series. The Battle of Blackwater Bay not only shattered Stannis' forces, but also drove a wedge into his relationship with Davos, one of the few men who remained loyal to him through thick and thin. Back in King's Landing, Tyrion's role in the defense of the city went far beyond the wildfire trap. While Joffrey, the so-called king, cowered and fled from the front lines, it was Tyrion who rallied the city's defenses. His leadership during the battle showcased a side of Tyrion that few had seen before. He wasn't just the clever schemer or the sharp-tongued Lannister outcast. He was a leader. Tyrion, standing in the breach, gave a rousing speech to the men defending the walls of King's Landing, reminding them that their survival and the survival of their families depended on their courage. It was a rare moment of heroism for Tyrion, one that solidified his role as a key player in the political and military landscape of Westeros. But even in victory, Tyrion's triumph was bittersweet. While he had saved King's Landing, earning the grudging respect of some, his contributions were quickly overshadowed. Tywin Lannister, arriving at the last moment with reinforcements, took the glory for the victory, and Tyrion, the true architect of the city's defense, was once again pushed aside. His near death at the hands of Sir Mandon Moore during the battle, a treachery likely orchestrated by Joffrey or Cersei, left him physically scarred and emotionally isolated. In many ways, the Battle of Blackwater Bay marked the beginning of Tyrion's disillusionment with his family and his role within the Lannister dynasty. For Stannis, the battle was a devastating blow to his campaign for the throne. Though he survived, his forces were shattered, his confidence shaken. Yet Stannis remained resolute, his sense of duty driving him forward despite the losses he had suffered. The relationship between Stannis and Ser Davos, though tested by the tragedy of Blackwater, would endure. Davos, ever loyal, would continue to serve Stannis, even as the king's choices became more desperate and morally questionable in the seasons to come. The Battle of Blackwater Bay, with its wildfire and chaos, was more than just a military engagement. It was a turning point for many characters. Tyrion's brilliance as a strategist was on full display, proving that even in a world of knights and warriors, intellect could win the day. The battle also highlighted the fragility of power in Westeros. Stannis, with all his strength and righteousness, was brought low by a single brilliant maneuver. In the end, it was Tyrion's mind, not Tywin's armies, that had saved King's Landing from certain destruction. As we leave the bay behind, the echoes of this battle will continue to shape the politics and power struggles of Westeros. Tyrion's scars, both physical and emotional, would drive him to seek new paths, while Stannis, undeterred, would continue his march toward destiny. And for the people of King's Landing, the sight of green fire lighting up the night sky would forever be etched in their memory as the night they narrowly escaped annihilation. The Battle of Blackwater Bay may have showcased Tyrion's tactical genius, but nothing could prepare Westeros for the overwhelming terror of the Long Night, where the dead themselves marched on Winterfell. It was the culmination of years of fear, whispers, and warnings. This was no battle for a throne, nor for power or vengeance. It was a battle for survival. The living versus the dead, and the stakes couldn't have been higher. The build-up to the battle was nothing short of tense. Winterfell had always been the stronghold of the North, but for the first time it would serve as the final stand for all of humanity. Jon Snow and Daenerys Targaryen had joined forces, uniting the forces of the North, the Unsullied, the Dothraki, and 2 living dragons in a last-ditch effort to stop the Night King's relentless army. They were prepared for war, but the truth is, no one could truly be ready for what was coming. The enemy was unlike anything they had ever faced, an unstoppable force of nature that didn't sleep, didn't feel, and didn't fear. The Night King's strategy was brutal in its simplicity: overwhelm, outlast, and destroy. His army, an endless sea of the dead, was relentless, crashing against the defenses of Winterfell like a tidal wave. The sheer number of whites threatened to engulf the living, forcing even the bravest warriors into retreat. The battle was not fought in broad daylight, but in the dead of night, shrouded in darkness, where every scream, every clash of steel, and every whispered breath of the cold wind added to the terror. At the heart of this nightmare was Jon and Daenerys, each leading their forces into what they knew could be their last fight. Daenerys and Jon rode their dragons into the fray, hoping their fire could stem the tide of the dead, but the Night King had prepared for them as well. His icy storm engulfed the skies, rendering the dragons nearly useless, blinding them and throwing off their attacks. It was clear from the start that this wasn't a typical battle. It was a war against death itself, and the living were losing. Key character moments defined the battle. Theon Greyjoy, once a traitor to the Starks, found his redemption on the very land he had once betrayed. Charged with protecting Bran Stark, the three-eyed raven, Theon stood against the Night King's army, knowing full well that this would be his final stand. His death was inevitable, but it was one of honor. In his last moments, Theon proved that he was, in the end, a Stark at heart. His death brought precious moments for Bran, delaying the Night King's inevitable approach. Melisandre's prophecy, hinted at throughout the series, also came full circle. The Red Woman had long predicted the coming of darkness, and her presence at Winterfell brought with it a glimmer of hope. She lit the Dothraki's swords aflame, a brief and stunning sight as they charged into the darkness. But that hope was quickly snuffed out as the flames disappeared into the night, extinguished by the overwhelming power of the dead. Melisandre's final act of prophecy, however, was a whisper to Arya Stark, a reminder that Arya's path had always been leading her to this moment, to the slaying of the Night King. Arya's journey throughout the series had been one of transformation. From a young girl who once dreamt of knighthood to a skilled assassin trained by the Faceless Men, Arya had become one of the most dangerous figures in Westeros. But no one expected that it would be Arya who would deliver the final blow to the Night King. As the battle raged on, with the living retreating and hope fading, Arya slipped through the shadows, unseen and unheard, much like death itself. And in one swift, breathtaking move, she ended the long night, plunging her Valyrian steel dagger into the Night King's heart, shattering him and, with him, his entire army. The death of the Night King was the moment that changed everything. His destruction marked the end of the dead's relentless advance. As he shattered, so too did his army, falling to the ground as lifeless as they had been before his magic had reanimated them. Arya had saved the living, but the battle had come at an unimaginable cost. The bodies of the dead, both the living and the reanimated, littered the battlefield. So many lives had been lost, and Winterfell itself had nearly been destroyed. But beyond the immediate victory, the implications of the Night King's defeat ran deep. For years, the Night King had been the looming existential threat, the figure who represented the ultimate end of all things. His defeat should have felt like a triumphant conclusion, but it left the survivors with an unsettling truth. The war for the throne would continue. The threat of the dead had been vanquished, but the living would go on fighting amongst themselves. The long night had brought all of Westeros together, if only for a moment. But now that unity would fracture once more. The Night King's defeat also raised questions about his origins. Who was he, truly, and what was his ultimate goal? The show offered glimpses of his backstory, hinting that he had once been a man turned into a weapon by the Children of the Forest. But why had he chosen this moment to march on the living? Was he driven by a desire for revenge, or had he simply been an instrument of death? These questions lingered long after the battle was won, leaving the audience to ponder the true nature of the Night King and his purpose. For Arya Stark, killing the Night King cemented her legacy as one of the greatest heroes of Westeros, but it also marked the end of her journey as an assassin. She had trained for years, driven by a desire for vengeance against those who had wronged her family. But in killing the Night King, she had fulfilled a far greater destiny. This act of heroism was not for her own gain or for revenge. It was for the survival of all humanity. The long night was more than just a battle. It was a test of will, of survival, and of the strength of the human spirit. As the sun finally rose over the broken walls of Winterfell, the survivors knew they had faced the ultimate enemy and lived to tell the tale. But they also knew that the hardest battles were yet to come. The living, having survived the long night, would once again turn their attention to the Game of Thrones, where honor, loyalty, and life itself were just as fragile as in the face of the dead. Before the cold terror of the long night ever descended upon the realm, there was a battle of fire, a clash so intense that it changed the course of the war in one violent, fiery sweep. This was the ambush on the Goldroad, a battle unlike any Westeros had seen in generations, where the traditional rules of warfare were burned away in an instant. The sun hung high in the sky that day, beating down on the dusty road as a triumphant army marched back from its recent victories. The soldiers, carrying the spoils of war, believed they were safely on their way home, armored and secure, with their gold and supplies in tow. Leading them was Jaime Lannister, the Kingslayer. Fresh off a hard-earned victory, he was burdened with more than just his battle armor. In his mind, he carried the weight of his family's future, the throne they had fought so hard to secure, and the pressure of winning a war that seemed never ending. But what Jaime didn't know, what no one could have foreseen, was the storm of fire that was about to be unleashed upon them. Unbeknownst to the marching soldiers, their enemy was watching from above. Daenerys Targaryen, the mother of dragons, had come to a critical point in her campaign. She had crossed the sea to take back the throne her ancestors had once ruled. But now, as her allies dwindled and her support faltered, she had something to prove. No longer content to play by the rules of conventional warfare, she was about to show Westeros exactly what dragons could do. Atop her trusted dragon, Drogon, Daenerys watched the Lannister forces from the skies. Her heart burned with a mixture of rage and purpose. These were the men who had supported the throne that had stolen everything from her family. But this was more than revenge. This was a show of strength, one she hoped would remind the realm who truly held power. Her advisors, Tyrion and Jon, had urged caution in previous battles, warning against unnecessary destruction. But as Daenerys flew above the Goldroad, the heat of the moment took over, and with a single command, she unleashed Drogon's fury. The scene that followed was unlike anything Westeros had seen in centuries. In the blink of an eye, the once orderly march turned into a battlefield of chaos. Drogon descended from the sky like a living tempest, and with a roar, fire erupted across the road, tearing through the lines of soldiers. The ground shook, and the screams of men echoed in the air as the sheer destructive power of the dragon turned the landscape into an inferno. Wagons full of food and gold, meant to sustain the war effort, were reduced to ash in seconds. Soldiers who had never faced anything like this before fell into panic, their training useless in the face of such an overwhelming force. Jaime, at the head of the forces, could only watch in horror as his men were consumed by the flames. The Golden Lion of Lannister, a symbol of power and prestige, now stood powerless against the might of a dragon. For Jaime, this was more than just a battle. It was a reckoning. He had fought in countless wars, faced down enemies from every corner of the realm. But nothing had prepared him for this. The weight of his armor was nothing compared to the burden of seeing his men, loyal soldiers, turn to ash in moments. The war was changing, and Jaime knew that if they didn't adapt, everything his family had fought for would be destroyed. But Jaime wasn't one to stand idly by in the face of danger. With courage bordering on recklessness, he grabbed his lance and charged toward the source of the destruction, determined to strike a blow against the enemy. He knew it was suicidal. He was riding straight toward the fire, toward a dragon of all things. But Jaime had never been one to shy away from impossible odds. In his mind, he was the Kingslayer, the man who had once saved the city from fire. Now he would try again, even if it meant his death. As Jaime charged, another key figure sprang into action, Bronn. The sellsword, known for his quick thinking and survival instincts, saw the dragon and knew that brute strength alone wouldn't save them. Bronn had been in battles before, but this was something else entirely. His eyes darted toward the massive weapon, a scorpion, a tool that had been specifically designed to take down creatures like Drogon. With no time to waste, Bronn loaded the massive bolt, took aim, and fired. The impact was direct. The bolt struck the dragon, and for a moment, there was hope. A fleeting sense that perhaps the impossible could be achieved. Drogon let out a screech of pain, wounded but still very much alive. Bronn had managed to do what many thought unthinkable. He had hurt a dragon. But even as the creature veered off course, it remained a force of destruction, its fiery breath still wreaking havoc on the battlefield below. Jaime saw his chance. With the dragon momentarily distracted, he charged, his lance aimed directly at Daenerys. The mother of dragons, vulnerable for just a split second, was within reach. But before Jaime could deliver the blow, fate intervened. The battlefield itself betrayed him. His horse was pulled under, and he found himself plunging into the depths of the river, dragged down by the weight of his armor. What had once seemed like a moment of glory turned into a near-death experience as the Kingslayer sank beneath the water, his fate uncertain. As the flames died down and the survivors regrouped, the psychological toll of the battle was evident. The soldiers who survived had seen what few men had ever seen, the true power of dragons. Their comrades had been incinerated, their supplies destroyed, and their morale shattered. This battle was not just about the loss of men or gold. It was about fear, the kind of fear that lingers long after the battle is over, that haunts the minds of soldiers and commanders alike. For Daenerys, the battle marked a turning point. The sheer devastation caused by Drogon had shifted the momentum in her favor, showing the world what she was truly capable of. But it also raised new questions. The dragon had been wounded. Her power, while immense, wasn't invincible. And as the dust settled, she knew the road ahead would be fraught with new challenges. On the other side, Jaime, having narrowly escaped death, was left to grapple with the reality of what had just happened. His bravery had been real, but it had also nearly cost him everything. And now he understood what his enemies were capable of. This battle had shown him, and the realm, that the war for the throne would not be won through sheer force or strategy alone. The rules had changed, and with them the entire landscape of the conflict. Long before the dragons returned to wreak havoc upon armies or the dead rose from the north, another war had gripped Westeros, a war that would reshape the future of the entire realm. This war was Robert's Rebellion, and its decisive moment came at the Battle of the Trident. Here, at the crossing of the river, two of the most iconic figures in Westerosi history clashed: Robert Baratheon, the Stag, and Rhaegar Targaryen, the Dragon Prince. The lead-up to this battle was the culmination of years of simmering tensions, betrayals, and perceived injustices. Robert's rebellion had begun as a fight against the oppressive Targaryen dynasty, but in truth, it was driven by something far more personal. Robert wasn't just fighting for the realm, he was fighting for love, for the woman he believed had been stolen from him. When Rhaegar Targaryen took Lyanna Stark, Robert's betrothed, it wasn't just a political abduction. It was a blow to Robert's very heart. And so, with his war hammer in hand and a rage unmatched by any other, Robert marched to end the Targaryen reign. As Robert gathered his forces, others rallied to his cause, none more important than his lifelong friend, Ned Stark. The bond between Robert and Ned was one of loyalty and brotherhood, forged in the heat of rebellion. Ned had his own reasons for fighting. His sister Lyanna had been taken, and the legacy of the Starks demanded justice. Together, Robert and Ned became the faces of a movement that would shake the foundations of the Targaryen dynasty. On the other side of the battlefield stood Rhaegar, a prince with a reputation for nobility, yet haunted by his role in the conflict. Rhaegar wasn't a madman like his father, King Aerys II, nor was he driven by pure malice. In fact, many in the realm had admired the prince for his intelligence, charm, and potential to be a great ruler. But his actions, particularly the abduction of Lyanna, had set the realm ablaze. Now, standing on the banks of the Trident, he faced the consequences of his choices. The stakes of the battle couldn't have been higher. Whoever emerged victorious would decide the fate of the Seven Kingdoms. If Rhaegar triumphed, the rebellion would be crushed, and the Targaryens would continue their rule. If Robert prevailed, the Targaryen dynasty, which had ruled for nearly 3 centuries, would fall. The battle itself was fierce, a chaotic clash of steel and blood as 2 massive armies collided on the riverbanks. The Trident, once a peaceful crossing, became a symbol of the war, a place where the past met the future and where destiny would be decided. The soldiers on both sides knew the importance of this fight, but it was the duel between Robert and Rhaegar that would live on in legend. Robert Baratheon, towering and powerful, was a warrior born. His massive warhammer was as much a symbol of his strength as it was a weapon. As he charged into battle, his fury was palpable. This was not just a fight for power, but a deeply personal vendetta. Across from him, Rhaegar Targaryen, dressed in gleaming armor and carrying his famed sword, Dorne, stood ready. The 2 men, so different in many ways, yet tied together by fate, met in the center of the chaos, and the future of the realm hung in the balance. Their duel was not just a physical contest, but a symbolic one. Robert representing the new order, the rebellious force of the people, against Rhaegar, the last hope of the old dynasty, a prince who many believed was destined for greatness. But in the end, it was Robert's raw strength and unyielding will that prevailed. With one crushing blow from his warhammer, Robert struck Rhaegar down. The impact shattered the prince's chest, and as he fell, the rubies from his armor scattered into the river, their gleaming red stones mixing with the blood of the fallen. The symbolism of Rhaegar's rubies, carried away by the currents of the river, represented more than just the death of a prince. It was the end of an era. The fall of Rhaegar marked the collapse of the Targaryen dynasty, a family that had ruled over Westeros with dragons for generations. In that moment, the dragon died, and with it, the last hope for Targaryen rule was washed away. But the consequences of this battle rippled far beyond the battlefield. With Rhaegar dead, Robert's path to the throne was clear. His rebellion had succeeded, and within a short time, he would be crowned King of Westeros, marking the beginning of a new Baratheon dynasty. The realm, long dominated by fire and blood, would now be ruled by Robert's fierce but flawed leadership. Yet, while Robert may have won the battle, the ghosts of the past were far from gone. Rhaegar's death left questions that would haunt the realm for decades to come. The truth behind Lyanna Stark's abduction, long shrouded in mystery, would one day reveal secrets that could threaten to unravel everything Robert had fought for. And the Targaryens, though defeated, were not entirely gone. Far across the narrow sea, Rhaegar's surviving children were growing up, unaware that one day they too would seek to reclaim the throne their family had lost. For Ned Stark, the aftermath of the battle was bittersweet. He had fought beside Robert, his brother in arms, and helped him rise to power. But the victory had come at a cost. The rebellion had taken lives, and the death of Rhaegar, despite his actions, left a mark on the realm's collective memory. As Ned stood on the banks of the Trident, watching the last remnants of the Dragon Prince's rubies disappear into the water, he knew that this battle, while victorious, had changed everything. In the years that followed, the Battle of the Trident became the stuff of legend. Songs were written about the duel between Robert and Rhaegar, and stories of Rhaegar's rubies scattered in the river were told to children all across Westeros. Yet for those who had lived through it, the battle was not just a moment in history. It was the turning point in their lives. Robert, once a warrior full of fire, would ascend to the throne, but find that ruling was far harder than rebelling. Ned, bound by duty and honor, would return to the north, carrying the weight of the past with him. And the legacy of Rhaegar, the last Dragon Prince, would linger on, shaping the future of the realm in ways that no one could have foreseen. Before the chaos of the War of the Five Kings consumed Westeros, the battlefields were dominated by strategies and shifting allegiances. One of the earliest and most pivotal clashes in this war took place at the Green Fork, a battle that, while often overshadowed by later events, showcased Robb Stark's strategic brilliance and set the stage for a significant shift in the conflict. What transpired on that battlefield wasn't just a fight between armies. It was a carefully orchestrated move by Robb to turn the tide of the war in favor of the North. At this stage in the war, the young Stark Lord had much to prove. Robb, though barely more than a boy, had taken up the mantle of leadership after his father, Ned Stark, was imprisoned in King's Landing. The North rallied to him, their hopes pinned on his ability to protect their lands and deliver justice for his father. But Robb wasn't just fighting for honor. He was fighting to win, and that meant outthinking his enemies, not simply outmatching them in brute force. His opponent was none other than Tywin Lannister, the cold and calculating patriarch of the Lannister family. Tywin was a man feared and respected throughout the realm for his military genius and ruthlessness. His forces vastly outnumbered Robb's, and he had the resources to crush any rebellion. But Robb, in his wisdom, knew that taking Tywin head-on would be a mistake. The North's forces, loyal but smaller in number, needed to rely on something more than strength. They needed strategy. In a move that would solidify his reputation as a cunning commander, Robb Stark made the bold decision to split his army. It was a risky tactic. Dividing his forces meant weakening his main host, but it also gave him the element of surprise. Robb sent a decoy army, led by Roose Bolton, to the Green Fork to engage Tywin's forces. This was not the main battle, but a feint, a diversion to lure Tywin away from the true prize. While Tywin's attention was focused on this false battle, Robb himself led the bulk of his forces in a surprise attack on Jaime Lannister's camp at River Run. The Green Fork itself was a brutal and chaotic affair. The Lannister forces, confident in their superior numbers, marched into the battle expecting an easy victory. Tywin, ever the tactician, believed he was crushing the North's forces in one decisive move. But what he didn't realize was that the army before him was merely a fraction of Robb's full strength. As the two sides clashed, the battle quickly descended into a bloody melee, with neither side gaining a clear advantage. In the midst of this chaos was Tyrion Lannister, Tywin's youngest son, who had reluctantly been thrust into the war. Tyrion, known more for his wit than his combat prowess, found himself in the thick of the fighting. This was not a place where his sharp tongue or clever mind could save him. Armed with only the most basic knowledge of warfare, Tyrion's role in this battle was largely one of survival. He was far from home, far from the intrigues of court life, and now found himself at the mercy of the battlefield. Tyrion, riding alongside the Wild Hill tribesmen he had recruited to his cause, had little choice but to engage in the fight. Yet, despite his lack of combat experience, he threw himself into the fray, determined not to die a coward. But in the heat of battle, it wasn't long before fate, or perhaps sheer luck, intervened. As the fighting raged around him, Tyrion was knocked unconscious, the result of a savage blow that took him out of the fight before he could even register what had happened. For all his efforts, Tyrion's role in the Battle of the Green Fork ended not in glory, but in a haze of blood and unconsciousness. Meanwhile, as Tywin's forces fought at the Green Fork, Robb's real plan was coming to fruition. While Tywin was distracted, Robb launched his attack on Jaime Lannister's camp, catching the Kingslayer completely off guard. Jaime, for all his skill as a swordsman, was no match for the surprise and overwhelming numbers Robb brought to bear. In a swift and decisive move, Robb captured Jaime, taking one of the most valuable prisoners in the entire war. The capture of Jaime Lannister was a turning point in the War of the Five Kings. Jaime was more than just a skilled warrior. He was the eldest son of Tywin Lannister, and his capture left the Lannisters vulnerable in a way they had never been before. For Robb, it was a massive victory, one that solidified his standing as a serious contender in the war and gave him a powerful bargaining chip in negotiations. With Jaime in his custody, Robb held the upper hand, at least for the moment. But the consequences for Tywin were severe. Tywin, despite his brilliance, had been outmaneuvered by a young lord who had barely seen 2 decades of life. The diversion at the Green Fork had worked perfectly, pulling Tywin's forces away and allowing Robb to strike where it truly mattered. Jaime's capture was a devastating blow to Tywin's plans, leaving him to face the uncomfortable reality that his enemies in the north were far more formidable than he had anticipated. In the aftermath of the battle, the ripples of Robb's victory spread far and wide. The momentum in the war shifted significantly in favor of the North, and the Lannisters, for all their wealth and influence, found themselves on the back foot. Robb's decision to split his forces, though risky, had paid off in spectacular fashion. His reputation as a brilliant tactician grew, and for the first time, it seemed that the Starks had a real chance of winning the war. The Battle of the Green Fork also had personal consequences for the key players involved. Tyrion, having been knocked out of the fight, survived, but the experience was a humbling reminder of his vulnerability in a world of swords and shields. For Tywin, the loss of Jaime forced him to reassess his strategies and tighten his grip on his remaining forces. But for Robb, the victory was bittersweet. While he had won the day and captured the Kingslayer, he knew that the war was far from over and greater challenges lay ahead. This battle marked the beginning of a long and brutal conflict, one that would see alliances forged and broken, betrayals unfold, and blood spilled across the land. But on that day at the Green Fork, Robb Stark showed the realm that even a young wolf could outmaneuver a lion. Now let us visit House of the Dragon, where the Dance of the Dragons, the bloody civil war that tore the Targaryen dynasty apart, reached one of its most brutal and decisive battles, the Battle of the Bastion of Duskendale. This battle, fought between forces loyal to Rhaenyra Targaryen and those supporting her half-brother Aegon II, was a violent and chaotic turning point in the War of Succession. It wasn't just the ferocity of the fighting or the number of lives lost that made this battle significant, but also its devastating use of dragons, which reshaped the very landscape and the future of the Targaryen family. Duskendale had long been a key location in the Crownlands, a coastal stronghold situated near the capital of King's Landing. During the Dance of the Dragons, its strategic position made it a vital point of control for both factions. For Rhaenyra, who had declared herself the rightful heir to the Iron Throne, securing Duskendale was crucial in tightening her hold on the area surrounding the capital. Her supporters believed that controlling Duskendale would cut off vital supply lines to Aegon II's forces, weakening their grip on King's Landing. On the other hand, Aegon II knew that losing the stronghold would severely damage his chances of holding the throne, making Duskendale a critical flashpoint in their bitter struggle. The battle was not just a contest of swords and shields, it was a war of dragons, where fire and blood reigned supreme. The key players in this clash were formidable, each fighting for survival and the future of their chosen monarch. On Rhaenyra's side, Lord Darklyn of Duskendale, a staunch supporter of her claim, led the defense of the town and its bastion, determined to hold out against Aegon's advancing forces. Lord Darklyn's loyalty was fierce, and he knew that surrendering Duskendale would not only betray Rhaenyra, but also signal a devastating blow to the Black faction's morale. As the armies clashed, the battle quickly spiraled into one of the bloodiest engagements of the dance. The forces of Aegon II, led by some of his most trusted commanders, launched wave after wave of attacks against the bastion. Duskendale's defenders fought valiantly, but they were outnumbered and outmatched by the sheer brutality of Aegon's army. The fighting was fierce, with both sides suffering heavy casualties. But it wasn't until the dragons entered the fray that the true devastation began. Dragons had always been the ultimate weapons in Targaryen wars, and the Dance of the Dragons was no exception. On the black side, Rhaenyra's forces were supported by several dragons, each capable of raining fire and destruction down upon their enemies. But the Greens, Aegon II's supporters, had dragons of their own, and when these great beasts met in battle, the skies above Duskendale turned into a hellish inferno. The dragons, driven by their riders and the chaos of war, unleashed their fury on both the town and the battlefield, burning homes, soldiers, and anything in their path. One of the most terrifying aspects of the battle was the sheer unpredictability of the dragons. Though their riders sought to control them, the chaos and terror of the battle often caused the dragons to act on their own instincts. Fire engulfed entire sections of Duskendale, and civilians caught in the crossfire suffered greatly. The devastation was immense, with large parts of the town reduced to smoldering ruins. For the men on the ground, the sight of dragons battling in the sky was both awe-inspiring and horrifying. They fought not just against each other, but against the very forces of nature that had been unleashed upon them. But despite the overwhelming might of Aegon II's forces and the destruction wrought by his dragons, the battle took an unexpected turn in favor of Rhaenyra. Lord Darkland's forces, though weakened, managed to hold out long enough for reinforcements to arrive. These reinforcements, led by some of Rhaenyra's most loyal bannermen, launched a surprise counterattack on Aegon's forces. The element of surprise was critical, catching the Greens off guard and allowing Rhaenyra's forces to push back the assault on Duskendale. The role of the dragons in this battle cannot be overstated. While the fire and blood they brought to the fight were devastating, it was their presence that determined the outcome. Rhaenyra's dragons, though fewer in number, proved to be more decisive, especially when her side launched a coordinated aerial strike against Aegon's forces. One of the key moments in the battle came when one of Aegon's dragons was wounded in the skies above Duskendale, causing panic among the Greens and forcing them to retreat. With their air superiority threatened, Aegon's forces began to falter on the ground as well. The eventual victory of Rhaenyra's forces at the bastion of Duskendale was not just a tactical success, it was a symbolic victory in the greater war of succession. By holding Duskendale, Rhaenyra tightened her control over the Crown lands and demonstrated that her claim to the throne was still very much alive. The battle sent a message to Aegon II's supporters that the Blacks were not to be underestimated, even in the face of overwhelming force. However, the long-term implications of the battle were darker than the immediate triumph. The devastation caused by the dragons during the battle left Duskendale in ruins, its people scarred and its infrastructure destroyed. The town, once a vital stronghold in the Crown lands, was left in a state of disrepair that would take years to recover from. The Battle of the Bastion of Duskendale also foreshadowed the eventual downfall of both sides in the Dance of the Dragons, as the continued use of dragons in warfare caused unimaginable destruction across Westeros, ultimately leading to the decline of the Targaryen dynasty. In the grand scope of the Dance of the Dragons, the Battle of the Bastion of Duskendale stands as a testament to the brutal nature of the Civil War. It showed how dragons, once seen as symbols of Targaryen dominance, had become agents of destruction, leaving devastation in their wake. Rhaenyra's victory at Duskendale may have strengthened her position, but it also highlighted the futility of the war, where no matter who won, Westeros itself would pay the price. Now, let's take a break from large-scale battles and fiery dragon duels to visit a smaller but equally pivotal moment in the series, a moment of wit, cunning, and ruthless efficiency. We turn now to the Eyrie, high in the Mountains of the Moon, where Tyrion Lannister found himself on trial for his life. This was not a battle fought by armies, but a trial by combat. a trial that would introduce us to one of the series' most effective and morally ambiguous characters, Bronn. Tyrion Lannister, always quick to use his mind as his weapon, found himself in a precarious situation. Accused of crimes he didn't commit, he was held prisoner in the Eyrie under the watchful eye of Lady Lysa Arryn, sister of Catelyn Stark. Tyrion's sharp tongue, however, only made his situation worse. Outnumbered and surrounded by enemies, it seemed as though his fate was sealed. But as Tyrion often did, he used the law and tradition to his advantage. When all other options had failed, he invoked the ancient right of trial by combat, demanding that his fate be decided by a champion willing to fight on his behalf. It was a bold move, but one fraught with risk. Trial by combat was no small matter. It was a fight to the death, and it meant placing his life in the hands of another. When called to name a champion, Tyrion turned to the only person who had even a sliver of loyalty to him, Bronn, a sellsword with a reputation for getting the job done, no matter how dirty it might be. Bronn had no personal attachment to Tyrion, but he saw an opportunity, and Bronn was nothing if not a pragmatist. After all, in a world where gold could buy loyalty, the chance to serve a Lannister could prove lucrative. The stakes were high. On the other side of this trial stood Ser Vardis Egen, a knight of the Vale, a man of honor clad in heavy armor. He represented everything the traditionalists of Westeros valued: chivalry, nobility, and the idea that might should be used to protect the weak. Bronn, on the other hand, was the embodiment of the opposite, a man who fought dirty, who knew that victory wasn't about honor, but survival. As the two men prepared for combat, the contrast between them couldn't have been more stark. Ser Vardis, noble and heavily armored, stood as a shining example of knighthood. He was slow but formidable, relying on the strength of his armor and his training. Bronn, by contrast, appeared almost casual, dressed in simple, lightweight leather, relying on his agility and wits rather than brute strength. The fight would not be one of equals, at least not in the traditional sense. It was a fight between different worlds, the world of noble chivalry versus the world of survival at any cost. The tension in the scene was palpable. On one hand, there was the looming danger to Tyrion's life, who sat watching his fate being decided by the blade. On the other hand, the sheer absurdity of the situation was not lost on him or the audience. As the fight began, the humor of the scene quickly became apparent. Bronn didn't fight like a knight, and he had no interest in meeting Ser Vardis head-on in a fair contest. Instead, he danced around the knight, dodging his slow, powerful strikes with ease. Bronn's strategy became clear from the start: tire Ser Vardis out, make him work for every swing, and let the weight of his armor become his downfall. The longer the fight dragged on, the more Ser Vardis's exhaustion became obvious. The heavy plate armor that had once been his strength now weighed him down, slowing his movements and leaving him vulnerable. Bronn, quick and relentless, took every opportunity to exploit this, landing small but effective blows, each one designed to wear down his opponent just a little more. Throughout the fight, Tyrion's wit and humor were on full display as he watched with an almost detached amusement. He had bet everything on Bronn, and as unconventional as Bronn's fighting style was, Tyrion knew he had made the right choice. The contrast between Tyrion's cool demeanor and the growing desperation of Ser Vardis was striking. Tyrion's fate hung in the balance. but his confidence in Bronn never wavered. And then, in one final move, Bronn seized the moment. He saw his opening, a brief moment where Ser Vardis, now exhausted and off balance, left himself exposed. With ruthless efficiency, Bronn struck, using the knight's own momentum against him. Ser Vardis fell to the ground, defenseless and winded. Bronn didn't hesitate. He drove his sword through Ser Vardis, ending the fight with a brutal finality that left no room for doubt. There was no honor in it, no grand display of chivalry, just cold, hard reality. The tension that had filled the hall dissipated in an instant. Bronn had won, but not in the way the nobility of the Vale had expected. There were no cheers, no admiration for his skill, just the stunned silence of those who had expected to see the old ways of knighthood prevail. In that moment, Bronn became something more than just a sellsword. He became a key player in the world of Game of Thrones, someone who would prove loyal to Tyrion not out of love or respect, but out of the understanding that Tyrion could be a valuable ally. For Tyrion, the victory was more than just a reprieve from certain death. It was proof of his ability to manipulate the systems of power in Westeros to his advantage. The trial by combat, an ancient tradition steeped in honor, had been turned on its head. Tyrion had won not through strength of arms, but by choosing a champion who understood that victory wasn't about honor, it was about surviving. This moment established Bronn as one of the most unconventional yet effective characters in the series. He wasn't a knight, nor did he adhere to the codes of chivalry that dominated Westerosi society. But what he lacked in nobility, he made up for with cunning, ruthlessness, and the ability to adapt to any situation. In many ways, Bronn's victory over Ser Vardis was symbolic of the shifting tides in Westeros, where the traditional rules were being challenged and new, less honorable forces were rising to power. As for Tyrion, this trial by combat marked the beginning of his long and complicated relationship with Bronn. It was a partnership born not out of trust or friendship, but out of necessity. And as the series unfolded, Bronn would prove time and time again that while he may not be the most honorable ally, he was certainly one of the most reliable when it came to surviving in a world as dangerous as Westeros. Now, let us turn our attention to a conquest that reshaped the very fabric of Westeros, an event so momentous that it continues to echo through the history of the realm. This is the story of Aegon the Conqueror and his first great victory, where dragons, ambition, and a vision for the future forged the beginnings of the Targaryen dynasty. Long before the Dance of the Dragons or the War of the Five Kings, Westeros was divided into multiple independent kingdoms. The Reach, the Stormlands, the Riverlands, the North, and others all ruled themselves, answering to no higher power. The land was fractured, with each kingdom vying for dominance, alliances shifting, and wars breaking out. But across the narrow sea, on the island of Dragonstone, a different kind of power was brewing. A power born not of knights or castles, but of dragons. The Targaryens, descendants of old Valyria, had fled the doom with their prized creatures, and now they had their sights set on something far grander: the unification of Westeros under a single rule. Aegon Targaryen, known to history as Aegon the Conqueror, was not content to simply rule Dragonstone. He had a vision of uniting the Seven Kingdoms into one, creating an empire that would be remembered for generations. But Aegon didn't come to Westeros with a massive army. Instead, he came with something far more powerful: dragons. Alongside his sister wives, Rhaenys and Visenya, Aegon brought 3 dragons to the shores of Westeros: Balerion the Black Dread, Meraxes, and Vhagar. These were not ordinary weapons. They were forces of nature, capable of laying waste to entire armies, and Aegon knew how to use them. The first major challenge to Aegon's conquest came in the form of a united front between the kings of the Reach and the Stormlands. These 2 kingdoms, each mighty in their own right, saw Aegon's invasion as a threat not just to their power, but to the very order of Westeros. King Meereen the Ninth of the Reach and King Argilac the Arrogant of the Stormlands formed an alliance, combining their forces to meet Aegon in open battle. Together, they believed their combined might would crush this foreign invader and end his ambitions before they could truly begin. But Aegon was no ordinary conqueror. He had studied the histories of war and understood that brute strength alone would not be enough to subdue Westeros. What Aegon had, however, was the ability to change the rules of war. While the armies of the Reach and the Stormlands prepared for battle in the traditional sense, with lines of infantry and cavalry ready to engage, Aegon and his sisters took to the skies. The dragons, with their vast wingspans and devastating fire, were unleashed upon the battlefield. The battle, which came to be known as the Field of Fire, was unlike anything Westeros had ever seen. As the armies clashed below, Aegon and his sisters descended upon them with dragon fire. The flames engulfed the forces of the Reach and Stormlands, burning men alive, melting armor, and turning the battlefield into a scene of pure devastation. The sheer power of the dragons was enough to turn the tide of the battle almost instantly. What had once been a confident alliance between 2 powerful kings quickly turned into a rout. King Meereen the Ninth of the Reach was killed in the flames, along with much of his army. The Targaryen dragons had decimated the opposition, leaving the survivors in disarray. King Argilac of the Stormlands, realizing the futility of continuing the fight, attempted to rally his remaining forces, but it was no use. Aegon's victory was complete, and the combined forces of the Reach and Stormlands were broken. This battle, the first major test of Aegon's conquest, set the tone for the rest of his campaign. Westeros had never before seen the likes of dragons in battle, and the sight of entire armies falling to their flames sent shockwaves throughout the continent. But Aegon's conquest was not just about overwhelming his enemies with dragon fire. Aegon understood that to truly unify Westeros, he would need more than just force. He would need loyalty. After his victory at the Field of Fire, Aegon turned to diplomacy. He offered the lords of Westeros the chance to bend the knee and swear fealty to him, promising them security and stability under his rule. Many, seeing the futility of resistance, accepted his terms. The House of Gardner, which had ruled the Reach for centuries, was wiped out in the flames, and the powerful House Tyrell rose in its place as Aegon's loyal bannerman. Argilac the Arrogant died shortly after the battle, and the Stormlands passed into the hands of Aegon's supporters. Aegon's victory was more than just a military triumph. It was a symbolic moment that marked the beginning of a new era for Westeros. The kings of the various regions were no longer independent rulers. They were now lords, subject to the will of the Iron Throne. Aegon's decision to create a unified Westeros under his rule set the foundation for the Targaryen dynasty, which would reign for nearly 3 centuries. The Iron Throne, forged from the swords of Aegon's defeated enemies, became the ultimate symbol of his power. And while the dragons were the tools of his conquest, the Iron Throne was the symbol of his lasting legacy. The unification of Westeros under Aegon also marked a significant shift in the balance of power in the continent. No longer would the various kingdoms wage endless wars against each other for control of the land. Under Aegon's rule, peace, however tenuous, was established, and the Targaryen dynasty brought a sense of stability that Westeros had not known before. The lords of Westeros, while still powerful in their own right, were now bound by their oaths to Aegon, and the constant wars between kingdoms gave way to a more centralized rule. The symbolism of Aegon's conquest extends far beyond his military victories. It was a moment when Westeros itself changed, when the fractured and warring kingdoms became one under a single ruler. Aegon's use of dragons not only ensured his victories, but also demonstrated that the old ways of fighting wars, with knights, horses, and infantry, were no longer sufficient in the face of such overwhelming power. His ability to conquer with dragons showed that Westeros had entered a new age, one where Targaryen rule, marked by fire and blood, would shape the future of the continent. In the aftermath of the conquest, Aegon became more than just a king. He became a legend. His descendants would continue to rule from the Iron Throne, using the dragons as both a symbol of their power and a tool to maintain their hold over the realm. But it all began with Aegon's first great victory, where the Field of Fire not only cemented his claim to the throne, but also forever changed the course of Westerosi history. Now we return to a battle that changed the fortunes of one of the most complex and tragic figures in Game of Thrones, the Battle of Winterfell between Stannis Baratheon and the Boltons. This battle, fought in the frozen north, marked the end of Stannis' ill-fated campaign for the Iron Throne and solidified the ruthless Bolton hold over Winterfell, leaving a legacy of desperation, betrayal, and brutal consequences for the future of the North. Stannis Baratheon, the self-proclaimed rightful heir to the Iron Throne, had always been a man of unyielding determination and rigid belief in his own destiny. He saw himself as the only legitimate king, following the death of his brother, King Robert Baratheon, and the revelation that the children of King Robert and Queen Cersei were not true Baratheons, but products of incest. Yet, despite his claims and his unwavering sense of duty, Stannis' path to the throne was plagued by misfortune and increasingly desperate decisions. By the time Stannis turned his eyes north toward Winterfell, his campaign was faltering. After his failed siege of King's Landing, he sought to rebuild his forces and found himself drawn to the growing threat of the White Walkers in the north. After arriving at the Wall and offering his support to the Night's Watch, Stannis made the critical decision to march on Winterfell, believing that if he could retake the ancestral seat of the North, he could rally the Northern Lords to his cause. But this decision was fueled by desperation. His forces were already weakened, and the weather conditions in the north were nothing short of brutal. The Boltons, meanwhile, had firmly entrenched themselves at Winterfell, and their army vastly outnumbered Stannis' battered forces. Stannis' desperation became more apparent in the days leading up to the battle. His campaign had begun to unravel. His supplies were dwindling. His soldiers were demoralized by the harsh winter, and his support was slipping away. In a final horrifying act of desperation, Stannis made a choice that would haunt him and seal his fate: the sacrifice of his own daughter, Shireen. This sacrifice, urged by Melisandre, the Red Priestess who had long been Stannis' most fervent supporter, was intended to invoke the Lord of Light's power to turn the tide of the war in Stannis' favor. But instead of bringing victory, this cruel act tore apart what little morale remained in Stannis' army. The death of his innocent daughter fractured his followers' faith in him, and even Melisandre, seeing the hopelessness of the situation, abandoned Stannis when he needed her most. As Stannis' army trudged through the snow toward Winterfell, they encountered an enemy that was not only better prepared, but also better positioned. The Boltons, led by the sadistic Ramsay Bolton, had the advantage of both numbers and home field advantage. Ramsay, ever the brutal tactician, harassed Stannis' forces as they marched, using guerrilla tactics to weaken and demoralize the already starving and frostbitten troops. By the time Stannis reached Winterfell, his forces were no longer an army. They were a shattered group of survivors, barely able to stand against the Bolton's superior numbers. The battle itself was swift and brutal. Stannis, ever the soldier, fought valiantly despite the overwhelming odds, but his army was quickly overwhelmed by the sheer size and ferocity of the Bolton forces. Stannis' tactical decisions, which had served him well in previous battles, were no match for the unrelenting Bolton assault. As his forces were cut down, Stannis continued to fight on, refusing to surrender or retreat, driven by his belief that he was still destined to be king. But Stannis' determination couldn't save him. Isolated and alone, his army decimated, Stannis was finally confronted by Brienne of Tarth. Brienne, who had sworn vengeance on Stannis for his role in the death of Renly Baratheon, Stannis' younger brother, found him injured and defenseless. In this final quiet moment, Stannis accepted his fate. Brienne, ever the honorable knight, carried out the execution swiftly, ending the life of one of the most tragic and complex characters in Game of Thrones. Stannis' defeat at the Battle of Winterfell had far-reaching consequences for the North and the broader political landscape of Westeros. With Stannis dead and his claim to the throne extinguished, the Boltons' hold on Winterfell was solidified. Ramsay Bolton, already infamous for his cruelty and brutality, was now the undisputed warden of the North, cementing his family's control over the region. The Northern Lords, already divided and weakened by years of conflict, had little choice but to accept Bolton rule, even as rumors of Ramsay's sadistic nature spread throughout the region. The Boltons' victory also had devastating consequences for the North's resistance to the Lannisters. With Stannis' campaign crushed and his army obliterated, the Northern Lords were left with no major force to rally behind. The hope of reclaiming Winterfell for House Stark seemed all but lost. The Boltons, having been legitimized by the Lannisters, were now positioned as the primary power in the North, enforcing their rule through terror and fear. Yet, while the Boltons celebrated their victory, cracks were already beginning to show. The cruelty and instability of Ramsay's rule alienated many of the Northern Lords, who had grown weary of his brutal tactics. The consolidation of Bolton power, while seemingly complete after Stannis' defeat, was tenuous at best. The legacy of the Starks still lingered in the hearts of many Northerners, and the memory of Ned Stark's honor and the Stark family's long history of rule over Winterfell was not so easily forgotten. In the end, Stannis' defeat marked not just the end of a campaign, but the death of a man who had once believed he was destined to save the realm. His rigid belief in his own righteousness, combined with his willingness to make terrible sacrifices, ultimately led to his downfall. The Battle of Winterfell, while swift and brutal, symbolized the collapse of his ambitions and the final failure of his claim to the Iron Throne. But while Stannis' story ended in the snow outside Winterfell, the consequences of his defeat would ripple through the north for seasons to come. The Boltons had won the day, but the seeds of their eventual downfall had been planted, and the memory of the Stark family, once thought lost, would rise again, stronger than ever before. Now we turn to a battle that was as much about strategy and alliances as it was about raw power, the Siege of Meereen. For the Mother of Dragons, this was a defining moment in defending her hard-won territory and demonstrated her evolving military acumen. The siege showcased not just a fight for control, but also the leadership that would propel her closer to the Iron Throne. When she first arrived in Meereen, it was as a liberator, having already freed Astapor and Yunkai. But Meereen was the jewel of Slavers Bay, and seizing the city was key to consolidating control. However, this victory came with challenges. The former slavers, known as the Masters, deeply resented her abolition of slavery, leading them to form an alliance with the remaining cities of Yunkai and Astapor to take back what they had lost. The Masters aimed to lay siege to Meereen, cutting off vital supplies and overwhelming the defenses from the sea, all in a bid to restore their grip on the region. As the siege began, the situation looked dire. The slavers' fleet had blockaded the harbor, effectively choking off the city's resources. The internal strife within Meereen only worsened the situation as the Sons of the Harpy, loyal to the old ways, continued their guerrilla attacks, destabilizing the city from within. In this critical moment, her reliance on trusted advisors became more apparent, particularly with Tyrion Lannister at her side. Tyrion, now a key figure in the city's administration, played a major role in managing the city while she was away, having flown off with Drogon after an earlier attack. Tyrion's diplomacy with the other cities bought time, but the siege showed the Masters were intent on reclaiming their power, and negotiation would only delay the inevitable clash. The real turning point came when she returned, riding atop Drogon. The city's defenders, demoralized by the siege, saw the return of their queen as a sign that victory was possible. The slavers, however, had underestimated the threat they faced. As the fleet blockaded the harbor, the dragons took flight. Drogon, along with Rhaegal and Viserion, unleashed a fiery assault that tore through the ships, engulfing them in flames and sending the enemy forces into disarray. While the dragons decimated the fleet, it wasn't just brute force that secured the victory. Recognizing the importance of alliances and diplomacy, she called a meeting with the Masters. It was here that her approach became clear. There would be no mercy for those who had betrayed her and attacked the city. After demonstrating her strength, she executed 2 of the 3 Masters present, sparing one only to send a message to the rest of Slavers Bay. Resistance was futile, and any further defiance would be met with fire and blood. Meanwhile, her loyal forces on the ground played equally critical roles. Grey Worm, the commander of the Unsullied, led a counter-offensive within the city walls, systematically wiping out the remnants of the Sons of the Harpy. His disciplined and precise approach ensured that the internal threat was neutralized. Outside the city, Daario Naharis commanded the Dothraki cavalry, leading a devastating charge against the Master's ground forces, crushing any remaining resistance. Tyrion's political savvy also shone during this time. While the dragons provided the spectacle of overwhelming power, Tyrion's handling of the city's internal strife helped maintain stability. His efforts to manage the freedmen and balance the volatile situation within Meereen proved vital to preventing the city from collapsing into chaos during the siege. The victory at Meereen marked a major milestone in her path to the Iron Throne. It wasn't just a victory on the battlefield, but a demonstration of her ability to hold what she had conquered. The alliances she had forged, particularly with the Dothraki, Unsullied, and Tyrion, became the foundation for her larger campaign. These were not just soldiers in her army, but fiercely loyal allies who had seen her lead through both fire and strategy. The significance of this victory cannot be overstated. By breaking the siege and crushing the Master's forces, she solidified her role not just as a conqueror, but as a protector of the people she had freed. The Masters, who had once controlled vast portions of Slaver's Bay, were now decisively beaten, and their attempts to reclaim their former power were in ruins. The dragons had shown their strength, and the world had seen the return of Targaryen power, both in the air and on the battlefield. The siege of Meereen also marked a shift in her leadership style. Where once she had been more focused on liberation, this battle showed her capacity to govern and defend what she had claimed. Her use of overwhelming force against the Masters, paired with her calculated mercy, demonstrated a balance between ruthlessness and justice that would characterize her leadership in the years to come. In the end, Meereen became more than just another victory. It was a symbol of her ability to not only take cities, but also protect them. It was a testament to her ability to inspire loyalty and to strike fear into the hearts of her enemies. And it was yet another step toward Westeros and the Iron Throne, where her destiny ultimately lay. Now, let's delve into one of the climactic moments of the Dance of the Dragons, a battle that reshaped the course of the Targaryen Civil War and left an indelible mark on the history of Westeros, the Battle of the Goldroad. This bloody confrontation between the forces of Aegon II and Rhaenyra Targaryen was a pivotal turning point in the conflict, solidifying Aegon's grip on the throne and marking the slow unraveling of House Targaryen. Though we may not have seen this particular battle unfold yet in House of the Dragon, it looms as one of the most dramatic moments that will undoubtedly take center stage as the series progresses. Set during the Dance of the Dragons, a civil war that pitted Targaryen against Targaryen, the Battle of the Goldroad occurred at a time when the war was nearing its breaking point. Aegon II and his supporters were locked in a brutal struggle for control of the Iron Throne against his half-sister Rhaenyra, who also claimed the throne. While many battles had already been fought, the Goldroad became a key moment, not only because of the scale of destruction, but because of the devastating use of dragons and the political fallout that would follow. The Dance of the Dragons was unique in Westerosi history for the sheer number of dragons involved. The Targaryens, descended from the dragon lords of Old Valyria, still commanded these fire-breathing beasts, and both Aegon II and Rhaenyra brought dragons into battle, using them to wage war in ways the realm had never seen before. At the Goldroad, this clash of dragons reached a devastating peak. Aegon II, eager to solidify his claim to the throne and end his sister's challenge once and for all, led his forces to intercept those loyal to Rhaenyra along the Goldroad, a vital supply route near King's Landing. The road itself had become a crucial strategic point, as it allowed armies and resources to flow between the capital and the western reaches of the kingdom. Control of this area was essential for both sides, but it would be Aegon's forces that gained the upper hand. Aegon II, riding his dragon Sunfire, was a key figure in the battle. Though Sunfire had been injured in earlier battles, it was still a force to be reckoned with. Alongside him was his most trusted ally and military commander, Sir Criston Cole, who led the ground forces into battle. On Rhaenyra's side, her loyalists included some of her strongest supporters, who were determined to break Aegon's hold over the throne. The battle quickly descended into chaos, with infantry clashing on the ground as dragons raged above. The role of dragons in this battle was both awe-inspiring and terrifying. These creatures, with their immense power, made conventional tactics almost irrelevant. Sunfire and other dragons unleashed torrents of fire upon Rhaenyra's forces, turning the battlefield into an inferno. Soldiers, horses, and entire companies were consumed by dragonfire, leaving charred remains in their wake. The dragons on Rhaenyra's side responded in kind, and the skies above the Goldroad became a battleground of their own as the beasts clashed in the air, talons and fire tearing at each other in a deadly aerial duel. The destruction was catastrophic, with both sides suffering heavy losses. But it was Aegon II's forces, bolstered by the strength of Sunfire, that emerged victorious. The carnage wrought by the dragons, combined with the disciplined leadership of Sir Criston Cole on the ground, allowed Aegon's forces to overwhelm Rhaenyra's loyalists. The defeat at the Goldroad was a critical blow to Rhaenyra's cause, weakening her position in the war and allowing Aegon to gain the upper hand. The immediate consequences of the Battle of the Goldroad were profound. Aegon II, having secured a major victory, reinforced his claim to the Iron Throne and began to consolidate his power. The battle also severely weakened Rhaenyra's ability to wage war, as many of her key commanders and dragons were either killed or captured in the fighting. The loss of Rhaenyra's forces at the Goldroad marked a turning point in the war, shifting the balance of power in favor of Aegon II and making it increasingly difficult for Rhaenyra to maintain her challenge to the throne. However, the long-term consequences of the battle, and indeed the entire Dance of the Dragons, were far more devastating. While Aegon II may have won the battle and secured the throne, the Targaryen family itself was irreparably damaged by the war. The use of dragons in such destructive ways had left much of the realm in ruins, with entire towns and regions decimated by fire and blood. Moreover, the civil war had shattered the unity of House Targaryen, with many key family members and dragons lost in the fighting. The devastation brought by the dragons at the Goldroad also had a lasting psychological impact on the people of Westeros. Where dragons had once been seen as symbols of Targaryen power and majesty, they were now viewed with fear and resentment. The destruction they caused during the war led to growing unrest among the people, who began to question whether the Targaryens were fit to rule. the once unassailable reputation of House Targaryen was tarnished, and the seeds of their eventual downfall were sown during battles like this one. The role of the dragons in the Dance of the Dragons was a double-edged sword for the Targaryens. While they allowed the family to wage war on an unprecedented scale, they also contributed to the sheer devastation that left the realm weakened and embittered. The losses suffered by both Aegon and Rhaenyra in terms of dragons and family members were immense, and the once mighty House Targaryen was left fractured and vulnerable in the aftermath of the Civil War. Though the Battle of the Goldroad was a victory for Aegon II, it came at a great cost. The damage done to the realm and to House Targaryen would have far-reaching consequences, leading to the slow decline of the dynasty. In the years following the Dance of the Dragons, the Targaryens would struggle to maintain their grip on the throne, and the dragons, once the source of their power, would eventually die out. For fans of House of the Dragon, this battle, if it has not yet been shown, is certain to be one of the major highlights in the series. The show has already depicted several key moments in the Dance of the Dragons, and the Battle of the Goldroad will be another crucial event as the series unfolds, providing viewers with a vivid depiction of the destruction and chaos that dragon warfare brings. It's a battle that not only showcases the terrifying power of dragons, but also the tragic consequences of Targaryen civil war. Few battles in Game of Thrones are as gripping and visceral as the Battle of Castle Black. This wasn't just a fight between two armies, it was a fight for survival against overwhelming odds, a battle that would test the leadership of Jon Snow, and one that would ultimately shape the fate of the North and the future of Westeros. The defense of the Wall against the wildlings showcased Jon's growth as a leader, his ability to rally the Night's Watch, and his willingness to make sacrifices for the greater good. The lead up to the battle was fraught with tension. Jon Snow, once an outsider among the brothers of the Night's Watch, had earned their respect through his bravery and sense of duty. But his time spent among the wildlings had complicated his loyalties. Jon had infiltrated the wildling camp as part of a reconnaissance mission, but he had also formed relationships with them, including his romantic bond with Ygritte. This relationship would become a source of deep emotional conflict during the battle. Jon knew that the wildlings were not mindless raiders. They were desperate people seeking refuge from the coming winter and the White Walkers. Yet, as a sworn brother of the Night's Watch, he had to defend the Wall against them. As the wildling forces, led by the fierce and charismatic Mance Rayder, began to prepare for their assault on the Wall, the Night's Watch found themselves hopelessly outnumbered. The wildling army included giants, mammoths, and a wide array of skilled fighters, and they had the advantage of numbers and ferocity. The Night's Watch, on the other hand, was depleted, their forces spread thin across the Wall. Many of the brothers were fresh recruits or criminals sent to the Wall with little training or discipline. The wildlings devised a two-pronged strategy to assault Castle Black. While the bulk of their forces attacked from the south, having already breached the Wall at several points, a smaller group of wildlings attempted to scale the Wall itself and attack the Night's Watch from behind. It was a tactical nightmare for Jon and his brothers, as they had to defend both the base of the Wall and the top at the same time. Despite the overwhelming odds, Jon's leadership shone through in the heat of battle. Though he was still young and relatively inexperienced in command, Jon had learned much from his time with the Night's Watch and the wildlings. He quickly took charge of the defense, rallying the men with a combination of stern commands and personal bravery. Jon knew that if the wall fell, it would not just mean the end of the Night's Watch. It would mean the end of the realm's first line of defense against the White Walkers. One of the most intense moments of the battle was the wildlings' use of giants and mammoths in their assault on the gates of Castle Black. The sheer size and strength of these creatures were enough to break through the heavy defenses of the wall. As the wildlings pressed their attack, Jon and his brothers found themselves struggling to hold the line. The tension mounted as the wildlings scaled the wall itself, creating a chaotic multi-front battle that tested the Night's Watch at every turn. In the midst of the chaos, Jon had to confront his feelings for Ygritte. She had been part of the wildling group that had infiltrated the south, and during the battle, Jon saw her once again, this time as his enemy. Their reunion was brief and tragic. As Ygritte drew her bow to shoot Jon, she hesitated, her feelings for him conflicting with her duty to the wildlings. In that moment of hesitation, Ygritte was struck by an arrow from another member of the Night's Watch. Jon rushed to her side, cradling her in his arms as she died, her final words a haunting reminder of their love. "You know nothing, Jon Snow." Her death was a personal blow to Jon, one that would stay with him long after the battle ended. Though the wildlings pressed their attack relentlessly, Jon's leadership and the bravery of the Night's Watch eventually turned the tide of the battle. One of the most critical moments came when Jon personally led a charge to defend the wall's inner gate. His willingness to put himself in harm's way, coupled with his strategic use of resources like the giant scythe to cut down wildlings climbing the wall, proved instrumental in repelling the attackers. In the end, the wildlings were forced to retreat and Castle Black held. But the cost of the victory was high. Many of Jon's brothers had fallen in the defense of the wall, and the Night's Watch was left severely weakened. Nevertheless, the battle had a profound impact on Jon's standing within the Night's Watch. His leadership during the battle earned him the respect of his brothers, many of whom had been skeptical of him due to his time with the wildlings and his youth. Jon had proven that he was more than just Eddard Stark's illegitimate son. He was a leader capable of making the difficult decisions necessary for survival. The political aftermath of the battle was equally significant. Jon's victory at Castle Black not only secured the wall, but also positioned him as a key figure in the North's future. In the wake of the battle, Jon was elected Lord Commander of the Night's Watch, a position that placed him at the forefront of the defense against the growing threat of the White Walkers. His actions during the battle solidified his role as a leader, not just within the Night's Watch, but within the broader story of the North's survival. The battle also had far-reaching consequences for the relationship between the Night's Watch and the wildlings. Despite the bitter fighting, Jon understood that the true threat was not the wildlings, but the White Walkers. In the aftermath of the battle, Jon would seek to forge an alliance with the wildlings, knowing that their numbers and strength would be crucial in the coming war against the undead. This decision, while controversial, would prove to be one of Jon's most important contributions to the fight for the survival of Westeros. The Battle of Castle Black marked a turning point in the broader story of Game of Thrones. It showcased Jon's transformation from a boy seeking his place in the world to a leader willing to sacrifice everything for the greater good. The battle also highlighted the looming threat of the White Walkers and set the stage for the Night's Watch to play a critical role in the defense of Westeros. Though the Night's Watch won the day, the battle was a reminder that the true war had only just begun. The victory at Castle Black may have saved the wall from falling to the wildlings, but the arrival of winter and the march of the White Walkers meant that even greater battles were yet to come. Jon Snow, having proven himself as a leader, would soon find himself at the center of that fight.